I came into this indifferent, and now I'm angry. No more Storm. No more Scott. No more Jean. No more X-Men. The following is an in-depth story analysis and retrospective. If you haven't seen this film, you might want to before listening to this review. Sometimes, the best things turn out to be too good to be true. I was over the moon after X-Men Days of Future Past, positively giddy with Xavier-like hope for the future of the X-Men franchise, after Matthew Vaughn breathed new, unconventional life into it with First Class, and Bryan Singer directed a surprisingly creative and poignant soft reboot in its sequel. After a movie that seemed not to totally know if it wanted to be a prequel or a reboot, in First Class, the last thing I could have anticipated to follow it was a First Class 2 and an X-Men 4 simultaneously. And then, despite all the confusing continuity retcons and gaffes throughout the series, up to and including Days of Future Past, it seemed none of that mattered anymore. The slate was cleared, like X-Men had its own little Crisis on Infinite Earths, which simplified and streamlined the universe, and it could start fresh again. But then, the same guy who seemed to have saved the franchise just 2 years later rushed out the obligatory third movie in this new trilogy and fell into all the same old traps, and even some new ones. I've rarely seen anyone go from hero to villain that quickly. It's like if Superman flew to the edge of Earth's atmosphere with the island made out of kryptonite, and then just dropped it right back down on civilization because he felt like it. At the risk of sounding like the Plinkett reviews from Red Letter Media, X-Men Apocalypse is the most disappointing thing since X-Men The Last Stand. And since I've referenced Plinkett, I'll steal another of his lines. Remember the Four Horsemen and that huge swath of the movie where they all stand around for a picture that nobody took? Sadly, this was the most comparable of all the more recent X-Men movies to X-Men 3, until its own sequel, Dark Phoenix, turned out to be a bizarre remake of X-Men 3. Days of Future Past felt like a tender and affectionate send-off for the whole series, even though we all knew there was more to come. And now I really wish it had been the end. Whenever I say that, somebody always comes back with, but what about Logan? Well, you could still have had that. That movie might as well have been its own continuity, and it's not a conclusion for this whole franchise like Days of Future Past could have been, but a last hurrah and an emotional finale for Hugh Jackman and Wolverine. And most importantly, it's a great film, so who cares about the continuity? Like The Last Stand, Apocalypse has too many new characters it barely develops, shafts its existing characters, and has them act counterintuitively or straight up out of character. Has tonal whiplash as it struggles to balance its levity with its drama, has a bombastic and boring third act battle where the stakes are enormous, but I can't bring myself to care, and it leaves me feeling numb and empty by the end. Apocalypse wasn't offensive to me on first viewing like I thought The Last Stand was with the death of Xavier, although Havoc's death here isn't handled any better. I guess I just cared more about Xavier and he didn't feel superfluous when he died like Havoc does here. His death is obligatory before it's gratuitous and shocking. But the more time I spend with it, the more I'm feeling pretty insulted, at the very least, and I'm starting to think this might actually be a worse movie than The Last Stand, as shocked as I am to hear myself say that. The baffling thing is, X-Men The Last Stand was such a misstep because of new blood in Brett Ratner that wasn't right for the project, and that maybe wasn't given enough time to develop the story properly after Singer stepped down. This is a lot of the same team that made Days of Future Past, throwing gasoline on their own action figures and setting them on fire, and maybe even getting high off the fumes. I've seen this happen before, of course. Sam Raimi with Spider-Man 3, and to a lesser extent, Christopher Nolan with The Dark Knight Rises. These are all different situations, and those third films are the worst in their respective trilogies for different reasons. Raimi was forced to use a villain he wasn't interested in with Venom, which wasn't all that was wrong with Spider-Man 3, but couldn't have helped in his enthusiasm for the whole project. And Nolan didn't seem to even want to make another Batman. So how is Apocalypse such a gigantic misfire, at least as bad as Spider-Man 3, and maybe worse? I think it's three things. A, it only came out 2 years after Days of Future Past, one of the most ambitious and logistically challenging superhero movies ever made. I can't imagine Bryan Singer wasn't burnt out by the end of that project, and he certainly sounds like he's burnt out at least by Apocalypse in his commentary here, and he turns right around and makes another epic with an even bigger scope and more impossible-sounding goals to accomplish, namely finishing a trilogy and starting a new one simultaneously. B, it's just not the right story premise after such a big event movie, or at the very least, it's a hard sell. You do a time travel movie where you have to wipe out a horrible future, and the very next thing you're gonna do is an end-of-the-world scenario? Now, I'll admit, I'm saying this in hindsight. I was stoked for this movie and didn't expect it to fall flat at all, but Singer earned the benefit of the doubt after delivering such a tall order in the last movie. That didn't sound like a thing anybody could pull off either, but he largely did. What was essentially a fan fiction done right on the big screen. So I was just along for the ride at that point. Unfortunately, the joke was on me. It turns out Matthew Vaughn may have been right when he said Days of Future Past should have been the third movie in the trilogy. That's an ender, not a second act, and that's the main reason he left that movie. I don't really understand his pitch about a young Wolverine in his idea for the second movie, but he's right that doing a follow-up to one franchise and finishing the first in the same movie makes it really hard to come up with a third one that would be a satisfying conclusion to what he did in First Class. And it kind of feels like there's a movie missing when you watch Days of Future Past. Don't get me wrong, I still love that movie, and as I said when I reviewed it, somehow Apocalypse has still not ruined my love for it one iota, but I think it's because that's such a great cap-off for the franchise, it's kind of easy to ignore the two generic and pointless attempts to continue it that have come after. I was all set to embrace a young reboot of some of the original characters from Singer's previous films and pave over that franchise with something fresh and totally different. But when that didn't happen, it was easy to go back and enjoy what worked and ignore what didn't, until I sat down to write about it. And now I'm forced to do all the thinking I didn't feel like doing when I saw this in the theater. See, the biggest difference in situations between this and something like Spider-Man 3 or Dark Knight Rises is that Apocalypse was missing a major ingredient to the success of the first two movies in this trilogy: Matthew Vaughn. He didn't direct Days of Future Past, but he did a lot of the heavy lifting for that story. And it makes me wonder just what ideas were Singer's there, because without Vaughn, it watches like he and writer Simon Kinberg don't really have a clue. The quality of storytelling, pacing, characterization, even mood and atmosphere are night and day between these two movies. Now, Vaughn's absence might not be the reason, but it's hard not to think that that's the likely culprit. Everything about Apocalypse feels manufactured. The heart of the first two films is missing, but the characters keep talking like it's about more than it is, and like they all have more regard for life than they do, and are more heroic than they really are. It feels like a series of outlined events strung together by flimsy excuses for plot points and character motivations rather than organic moments that happen because of natural choices characters make. And this movie doesn't seem to have the more pure and noble agenda the last one did, with priorities like serve the characters first and the fans second, and find a clever way to finally deal with this messy and broken continuity, and find new relatable metaphors for mutants and their powers, like Xavier's inability to use his telepathy properly as an allegory for personal insecurity and lack of confidence. The main agenda for this movie seems to be just cashing in on the popularity of the last one, and letting Singer do his version of all the stuff that was done without him when he was off this franchise. It either needed Vaughn back, which was never going to happen because he left X-Men to make the Kingsman movies, an original new IP that, like John Wick, the world kind of needed right then, so it's good that happened, but it certainly sucked for X-Men. Or it needed some brand new blood. As much as it pains me to say it, I don't even think John Ottman should still be scoring, and the franchise should still be using the X2 theme. That's my favorite fanfare in superhero movies, but it makes this whole thing lopsided as a trilogy. First Class seems to go its own way with some visual and historical connections to Singer's movies, but then When Singer takes over again, it's just more of his X-Men style, but a little more comic booky. Mostly because he's out of material to draw from that doesn't look a lot less grounded than anything he did before. Like Apocalypse, who he thinks looks so silly, he has to undercut that goofiness with lines like, "Who the F are you?" when Magneto sees him for the first time. Gotta get our one F-bomb in there, and it can't be Wolverine this time, because he's not talking. And that's not my interpretation of it. Singer says that's why that's there in his commentary. Days of Future Past, in being a reunion and a closing chapter for the original cast, should at least partly look and sound like X2, and it was an awesome novelty for me. But moving forward, I think it needs to get away from that. And Ottman has some rich and foreboding melodies in this score, particularly some of the Apocalypse character stuff, but it would have been smart to let each movie have its own sound, like the first trilogy did. Or at least bring back Magneto's haunting string electric guitar theme here. The only way Days of Future Past works as a second movie in a trilogy is if each movie is its own thing while presenting a new chapter in the lives of Xavier and Magneto, with 3 different tones or bookended with a similar one. It didn't have to be a proper trilogy at all. Not every film series has to come in 3s. And when they do, they don't have to be one story in 3 acts. Most of those that pretend they are by the end aren't really that in the first place, like The Matrix or the Dark Knight trilogy. This could have been more like the Captain America movies, where each is a story in a different genre, but the character or characters remain the same. Apocalypse wants to be 2 different movies at the same time. It can't begin to find a balance between them, so neither is done effectively. It's actually more like 3 things, though. It's not a good sequel, because it struggles to find compelling arcs for Xavier and Magneto, and at least Magneto seems out of character. It's not a good origin story for the new X-Men, because they all get shafted in their own movie, and most of them just serve as plot devices, or are introduced, like most everyone in Singer's first X-Men film, to maybe get fleshed out later. Jean is the deus ex machina at the end. Nightcrawler is here to teleport people around. The only new character who sorta gets an arc, besides Jean's throwaway embrace your powers, don't control them arc, which is just there so she can get her big Phoenix moment at the end, is Cyclops, who learns to be part of something bigger than himself and that his powers might be more than a debilitating curse. But he's hardly the focus of the movie, and he and Jean aren't much more developed than they were in the first trilogy, which shafted them both. And it also wants to be a prequel, even though it's paving over the original continuity, and it's not good at that either. It's like Star Trek 2009. It's supposed to be fun to see characters like Jean and Scott meeting for the first time, but they're not the same characters, and they're not meeting the way they did the first time around, one could assume, by virtue of a new timeline. So what is really the novelty there? The movie uses that as an excuse to change anything it wants to, even if the changes made by the end of Days of Future Past wouldn't actually alter those things, like Angel being a teenager in 1983 when he was also a teenager in The Last Stand. And it also refuses to change the things that would be really interesting, like letting Wolverine go a totally different direction than the tired Weapon X and Stryker scenario as was teased at the end of Days of Future Past. I can't begin to suspend my disbelief anymore. If the story was engaging, it wouldn't matter so much if it lines up, although some of Days of Future Past goals would seem kind of pointless then. I mean, why go through all that trouble to reset the continuity if you're just going to ignore whatever you want to anyway? Neither Logan or Deadpool fit into the overall timeline, but again, they work great as their own pieces. Just loosely connected to what we've had before, kind of like a biopic that's based on a true story. And they make it clear enough what matters and what they're ignoring. Not to mention that this timeline has been broken since the third movie. But this one doesn't just retcon stuff from throughout the rest of the X-Men franchise, it doesn't even follow from the previous movies in its own trilogy, with the main characters it's still using. It doesn't want to stand on its own. It references and builds on First Class and Days of Future Past while also contradicting those, and using a lot of quick flashbacks to them even, as if it's made by a filmmaker who doesn't get the material and just runs with the superficial things he likes, like Richard Lester making Superman 2. Except again, Singer has been here in some capacity since First Class, so now it has that Star Trek Into Darkness problem. And that was the same director successfully soft rebooting a franchise and then screwing it up himself the very next movie. I can't believe both of these properties do that. You reset the timeline from a specific point in universe, and then you can go anywhere you want with it from that point forward. It doesn't give you license to change just anything if you didn't straight up reboot. But neither J.J. Abrams or Bryan Singer are following their own rules. They both change whatever they feel like, damn the internal logic. So in Star Trek Into Darkness, Abrams changes Khan's ethnicity and gives him totally different motivations as a dictator during the eugenics wars, really oversimplifying him and making him less sympathetic, even though nothing about Nero changing history in the 23rd century would affect the 1990s. Singer takes Warren Worthington and displaces him in time, again making him a teenager in 1983 when he used to be a teenager decades from then. But Cap, some of you might be saying, why do you care so much about this broken continuity? Like you said, it's been broken going all the way back to 3. The Last Stand isn't good, so can't Singer take the license to use some of those characters in whatever time period he wants and improve on them? Look, that's fair, and I totally understand if this point doesn't bother you. But to that I say, 1, this is not an improvement. I know less about who Angel is in this movie than I did in X-Men 3, and he's killed off here, so there's no chance at developing him. At least I'm pretty sure he didn't make it out of that plane explosion. 2, Singer clearly wants the continuity to matter, or seem to matter, but he's cherry-picking what counts and what doesn't, and he's not even consistent about what bits in the mythology I should be keeping in mind. You could totally throw out X-Men 3, like we've pretty much done with X-Men Origins, but that movie informs Days of Future Past too much, like with Kitty Pryde being used to facilitate the time travel, and Kelsey Grammer's Beast at the end. Singer seems to use whatever he personally likes and pretends like other things didn't happen in the same movie. And he's even doing that with his own films, like with blatantly pretending Stryker wasn't Mystique at the end of Days of Future Past. There's really no good reason to have Angel here at all. The only reason I can fathom he's gotta be here is because the villain is Apocalypse, and Archangel is an iconic part of that mythology. But the other Horsemen are such random choices, Angel feels as out of place as they do, since it shouldn't even be possible for him to be here. I've never believed anything in a superhero movie less than Magneto as a Horseman of Apocalypse. More about that later. And 4, if we were never serious about being consistent with this continuity and fixing it, then why couldn't First Class have just straight up reboot the thing in the first place? If this movie can do whatever it wants to, why did Vaughn have to use such a counterintuitive First Class? That's not fair. If we're using Angel here, there's no reason he couldn't have been in First Class. You had a different female character named Angel there, when this makes it watch like you could have had the original all along. There's no reason that couldn't have been the classic 5 comic book X-Men. Scott never had to be Havoc's 20 years younger brother, and you didn't have to kill off most of that team in Days of Future Past just because they don't exist in future movies. I adore that film, and I'm glad things turned out the way they did until we got here, but so many odd choices were made in the name of preserving continuity, and Singer makes a lot of those decisions pointless retroactively. If Vaughn has even seen the last 2 X-Men movies, I wonder how he feels about all that. Bryan Singer has a laundry list of images he wants to see that have nothing to do with the story and seem to just be here because he's reasserting his dominance over the franchise. Singer is Apocalypse, the one true X-Men god, and he's gonna wipe away man's inferior works, replacing them with his own. And like with the gaudy CG world Apocalypse tries to build in this movie, what you're left with is dull, generic, and not any better than what you had before. This is a movie about an ancient mutant who's so powerful he thinks he's God, capital G, he calls himself that, who's going to destroy the world at its foundations and rebuild it in his own image. The stakes are higher than they ever have been. You don't get much bigger than the Apocalypse. Singer, for better or worse, is making a full-on disaster movie this time. And he also wants to make it an origin movie for the X-Men 3 movies in. Abrams' Star Trek franchise does that old chestnut too, where it can't look like the thing fans are there to see until it's nearly over. Reboots do that kind of thing all the time. You don't think your movie is already big enough? you're not already overextending yourself to the point where it's hard to imagine how you could do all that in a satisfying way. You also have to do Weapon X again, and the Phoenix again. Those things feel shoved in because they are shoved in, and very little thought is given to integrating them into the narrative. I always say you can make anything work, you just have to make it work. But your heart's also got to be in the right place. Singer doesn't seem interested in doing things well, so much as making sure they show up in something with his name on it. And that leads to structural problems. The entire second act, which is razor thin compared to the first and third, exists to give Hugh Jackman a stunt-laden action set-piece cameo. Like Fant Four Stick, this movie basically doesn't even have a second act, but rather than the last half serving as its own sequel, the beginning and end are both laborious, drawn-out sections with a pointless fan service interlude sandwiched between them, masquerading as the middle of the film. Seriously, the only reason you couldn't cut out the Alkali Lake sequence is that you wouldn't know where that jet and conveniently form-fitting flight suits come from when Mystique and Cyclops and the other X-Men show up for the Apocalypse fight at the end. Even blowing up the X-Mansion is contrived just to get us to Wolverine. Apocalypse and his horsemen come to Xavier after Havoc blasts Cerebro, because talking with Magneto telepathically alerts Apocalypse to Xavier's existence and makes him interested in his powers. Havoc then tries to blast Apocalypse, but he and his cronies escape through another portal and Havoc misses, accidentally destroying something in Hank's shop that looks suspiciously like a nuclear reactor. Singer confirms that's what it is in the commentary, I'm pretty sure that's the thing in the background he's talking about there, and claims the scene designer put that in the background CG and Singer thought it was weird but just ran with it. That's hard to believe since it leads to a major plot point. Why does Hank have what is essentially the atomic pile from Adam West's Batman? What could possibly go wrong? And if that is indeed what it is, it's also unintentionally funny that right after Apocalypse makes every nation get rid of all the nukes, when the movie suddenly becomes X-Men: The Quest for Peace, there's one left and it blows up Xavier's mansion. Right after Deadpool makes a joke about the mansion always blowing up in his movie, which only applied to the comics until this film. I mean, if you had to destroy the house, why not have Apocalypse do it? To demonstrate his might to Xavier, and it would be consistent with his hatred for idols and shrines to false gods. He'd see Xavier as counter to his vision, of course, because he wants to see humans and mutants live in harmony, and Apocalypse sees both groups as lower life forms. Apocalypse also wouldn't like Cerebro because it's a machine made to give people the power of gods, or to artificially amplify power, and he sees that as unnatural and wrong, men trying to cheat to attain godhood. He's the only being who deserves it, he thinks, because he believes morality is dictated by the strongest. He is unquestionably the strongest, and so his is the only will that matters. But if we don't blow up the house in a gradual explosion, Quicksilver can't run around rescuing dogs and balking at a gross kid about to make out with a girl and mess with another kid's hair, and, that would be a real travesty. So yeah, that explosion only happens to do three things. 1, get Stryker to the house and kidnap some X-Men so we can get Wolverine in here somewhere. 2, get rid of Havoc, I guess because he's expendable now that Singer's got Cyclops again, even though he doesn't need to die to match up with the later timeline because we've erased that now. Remember, that's why we got rid of the other first-class X-Men. And 3, as aforementioned, contrive a reason to do that slow-motion Quicksilver sequence from Days of Future Past again, which was an unexpected crowd-pleaser, and Singer can't help but run the gag into the ground. Not just by needlessly doing the same bit, but by going so over the top with such unrealistic-looking visual effects, and with slapstick and pratfall comedy at the most inopportune time, right after the most intense, earth-shattering, dramatic moment in the film so far, and right before the somber realization that Havoc has died a needless death in an explosion he caused so we can thin out the herd. There is some impressive stuff in that sequence technically, but I just think it's too overdone. Now, I might be laying too much of this at Singer's feet. After all, Simon Kinberg does have the sole screenplay credit, and this very much feels like a blueprint for his own X-Men movie, Dark Phoenix. Apocalypse Watch is much more like a Kinberg effort than a Singer one, but even though they're both on the commentary, Singer does much more of the talking and treats it like it's exactly the movie he wanted to make. By the way, a lot was made of the scene where Scott, Jean, Nightcrawler, and Jubilee are walking out of a movie theater, having just seen Return of the Jedi, where Jean says, "We can all agree the third movie is always the worst." Most fans took that as a slight against X-Men 3. In his commentary, Singer doesn't deny that might have been part of it, but he says they also wanted to poke fun at themselves and how difficult sticking the landing on a third movie is, which I respect, and I like how self-aware that Watch is in the moment. But I'd appreciate it a lot more if Singer wasn't talking about the movie like he thought he made a near masterpiece, and if it felt more like the movie was earnestly trying to tell a good story. This thing is really long, but it's still cut about 20 minutes worth of material for time. Some of that should be here, like the mall montage, just because it's downtime for our new characters and the only time we spend at all with Jubilee, and besides bamfing people around, there's not a lot of other stuff from Nightcrawler, and this being the only time I've ever seen myself maybe liking Jubilee, it's a crying shame she's in the final version only slightly longer than all those other times some version of that character had a background cameo at the mansion. You might not have noticed her, but Jubilee actually exists in the original trilogy at about the same age she is here, just like Angel. And some of that deleted material is rightly deleted, like Xavier's stupid speech where he repeats that silly Storm, Scott, Jean line Wolverine had in Days of Future Past on the plane, and an insane moment where Jean shoots an arrow at some kids just to practice her telekinesis, using her mind to send it at a bullseye on a target, getting around the kids, but minutes before she tells Cyclops she has difficulty controlling her powers. I'm glad that's not here, but I can't believe they shot it. Anyway, for good or ill, if you didn't have the pointless Alkali Lake sequence, you could put all the deleted stuff back in the movie and it would be the exact same runtime and tell the exact same story, minus some other way you'd have to contrive to get the kids to the big fight at the end. Here's an idea. Just don't blow up the mansion, and then you can just use the jet Hank's been building while Xavier is naive enough to think the X-Men are unnecessary, just because Mystique didn't murder a man on national television in apparently the most inspiring way imaginable. This is the most heartbreaking thing to me in the movie, and also the most unfair to fans. You make us think anything is possible at the end of Days of Future Past, that surely you're going to go to totally unexpected places and explore these characters in a way you couldn't have conceived of before, by having Mystique pretend to be Stryker and grab up a drowned Wolverine. And then 10 years later, he's just in exactly the same place he was in the original timeline, except now he has that iconic Weapon X look from Barry Windsor Smith's comics. And instead of doing anything mysterious and exciting with Mystique, we'll just make her the leader of the X-Men at the end. No mention whatsoever of that ending, no explanation as to what Mystique was doing with him, or how he got to the actual Stryker, nothing. We know the Mystique eye flash was added to footage that was originally intended to be Stryker, so it's like Singer just did that to call back to the end of X-Men 1 and never actually intended on following up on it. That's the first hint that something is amiss with him, that he cares more about moments than a cohesive whole. Again, I guess him and Kinberg. By the way, there have been rumors that Kinberg actually directed some of this movie. I can't confirm any of that, and there's certainly no discussion of that anywhere on the Blu-ray, of course. And suddenly, Singer is looking more like Zack Snyder. That's what this movie feels like to me. A movie made by Zack Snyder and J.J. Abrams. We'll throw Wolverine in there because the fans will love seeing all that carnage and the thing they know from the comics, and we'll also lift dialogue directly out of an earlier beloved film in the franchise and shove it into a scene where it hardly belongs, like Into Darkness did with the Spot Kirk dialogue from the classic death scene. Here, that's done with the "doesn't it keep you up at night" exchange from X-Men 1, Magneto talking about a day when someone will come to the mansion for Xavier's children. He says it at the end of this movie, after that's happened already, in this film, with Stryker, the same guy who came for Xavier's children in X2, as a payoff for that line. The flimsy excuse to include Stryker again with none of the motivation still that he had in X2, because he's apparently the only military man with any authority in the country, is that the mansion was the epicenter for the psychic event that the world witnessed when Apocalypse made his crazy no more weapons speech and got rid of all the nukes. So Stryker shows up to detain some, but not all, of the mutants lying on the lawn after the big explosion. Of course, to use in his mutant weapons program under the pretense of national security. I mean, I want to like the parallel of Stryker and Apocalypse doing the same thing, using mutants as weapons for their own goals, both because of their obsession with power. And I really like that idea with Apocalypse and no more superpowers, where he has superpowers and doesn't think that humans should be able to have nations that are called superpowers because human beings don't have superpowers. But nothing is done with any of that. I imagine that's a coincidence before it's an intentional thematic connection. Here's why it's flimsy. How can Stryker monitor psychic events? What besides the explosion, which is not the reason he showed up there, told him that's where the signal came from? Maybe the CIA developed something like that after working with Xavier in First Class? But Stryker is not CIA. And remember, this is before Apocalypse makes Xavier deliver his message to the world, so it's not because he hears Xavier's voice. Then, Jean lets Wolverine out of his pen to create a distraction so they can escape. And now, like so many characters in this movie, she is responsible for a ton of deaths she had to have anticipated. Before she uses her telekinesis to raise the bar on his door and release him from his steel box, I wish someone would have raised the bar on this mess of a movie, she reads Logan's mind and says, in the same breath, that he's no animal, and that the human part of his mind has been taken from him. Okay, so if he's missing his humanity, he's basically an animal, right? So you should expect, if you can read his instincts and his intentions, that if you let him out, he's going to slaughter everyone in sight, which is what he does. Just to force that scene, again, from Windsor Smith's book. Way to go, Jean! And then it's played as a clever prequel scene, setting up the Jean Scott-Wolverine love triangle that has never been anything but forced drama, when she gives Logan back some semblance of his old memories, setting him on the path of finding his humanity again. I guess I like that this would give him some reason to immediately like her so much when they meet again in the future, but it's that stupid prequel thing where every major beat you know from later stories has to be teased and informed by something that happens earlier retroactively. And again, in a continuity we're paving over, where things could happen totally differently if the writers want them to. And what's really odd about that is when you hear her say Logan to Wolverine in his head, it sounds suspiciously like Femke Jensen's voice, not Sophie Turner's. I've gone back and listened to this several times, and I swear the memory she gives him back is that of Jean from the future. And if I'm right about that, it just makes no sense, because he wouldn't even have that memory. Obviously. Yeah, Wolverine from the future commandeered his body 10 years ago, but he took all those memories with him. In the commentary, Singer talks like the sexual tension between Wolverine and Jean is there from the beginning, in that moment. Which is awkward for obvious reasons, and also just isn't the scene I'm watching. The whole thing is the worst kind of fan service. It's nonsensical, and it wastes time that would be better spent, exploring the ideas inherent in the Apocalypse plot. There was a really thought-provoking thematic idea in the trailer I was all set to see explored when I saw the movie, and it does nothing with it whatsoever. It doesn't handle the religious implications of Apocalypse in anything like a mature or thoughtful way. When Moira says maybe the Bible got the idea of the Four Horsemen from Apocalypse, that has the potential to change absolutely everything about how people see the ideas of God and faith. There's such a cool science fiction what-if statement there. What if mutants are the basis for religious mythology? In general, how do you define God when people who are the next step in human evolution can perform what the Bible considers miracles, and have been doing that since antiquity? Every time Apocalypse took over a civilization, the people would eventually rebel and he would destroy that society, which is a fun alternate history explanation for real-world mythologies and the destruction of ancient cultures, like the Star Trek episode Who Mourns for Adonis, which plays in the background in the scene where Apocalypse recruits Storm and taps into cable and satellites to find out what has happened to the world since he was entombed. Apparently, Bryan Singer and John Ottman are both huge TOS fans. Ottman, who both edits and scores Singer's films, which is why footage from The Naked Time shows up in Days of Future Past. This is another example of this far inferior movie repeating the last one, maybe because it is so creatively bankrupt, but in this case, it's a great choice, I think, foreshadowing humanity's defeating Apocalypse and abandoning the notion of needing a literal god to rule them. Which is why it doesn't surprise me at all that Ottman came up with that, and not Singer or Kinberg. There's some thematic resonance for what Apocalypse might mean to humanity in the modern day in that one clip than is explored in this entire film. In Who Mourns for Adonis, Kirk and crew discover that Apollo from Greek mythology is living on a planet on his own, desperate to be worshipped to survive, and that the Greek gods were actually an alien race that came to our planet and acted as gods. We don't get any more about cults that worship Apocalypse after the one that unearths him gets crushed, or anything about how secular religions respond to him, or whether new religions are spawned, or if people start worshiping mutants in mass, or if this shatters people's whole understanding of the world and drives them mad, or makes some of them commit suicide. And I really think some of that stuff should be in there. I recently reviewed Silver Surfer Parable on the YouTube channel by Stan Lee and Mobius, a story about Galactus coming to Earth, proclaiming himself God, and telling humanity to worship him without the wisdom or guidance to warrant that allegiance. It's all about what's truly right and wrong versus an arbitrary morality handed down by a godlike being, and how people can be so desperate to be led and to not have to think for themselves, they'll go wherever the power is, ignoring the consequences and giving up their precious freedoms so that they don't have to have any responsibilities. Stan Lee suggests that giving in to the will of a god, air quotes, robs humanity of its own potential power, to be better than any one powerful individual, that we as a species have the capacity to do what is right based solely on our inherent understanding of good and evil. In that story, there's a televangelist who tries to capitalize on Galactus by proclaiming himself Galactus's prophet. By the end, when Galactus refuses to help his sister after she falls to her death, he realizes Galactus is as out for himself as he was, and realizes he was wrong to follow Galactus. I know this isn't a Silver Surfer story, and there's no reason anyone involved in this movie should have necessarily read Parable, but if I could have, I would have handed Kinberg and Singer a copy of that book before they made this movie. There's a human element that's sorely lacking here, and it's oozing with the potential for a lot of good social commentary about humanity's relationship with people in power, how we tend to follow them out of fear or adulation or opportunism, regardless of how they use that power. And it's just not here. I never want to rewrite a story, but the possibility of Apocalypse making the society totally rethink where it came from is introduced, and then we never deal with the people on the ground, or even how our main characters feel about it. Xavier seems to adapt on a dime to the idea that the whole concept of godhood comes from mutants in the first place. Wouldn't he feel something about that? Wouldn't that inform how he tries to realize his dream of peaceful and equal cohabitation between humans and mutants? He's thought about how humans often fear and hate what they don't understand, but what about the other side of that? When humans worship mutants, can't that be just as dangerous and detrimental as Silver Surfer preaches in Parable? And given that humanity at large hasn't known about mutants for more than a decade, which is hard to believe if they've existed going back to the birth of civilization, if I'm Xavier, I'd be nervous that the whole Apocalypse thing could start all over again with another powerful mutant, or a group of them like a pantheon, and that after Apocalypse, humans could react to mutants in all kinds of scary and unpredictable ways. But there's no discussion about that. Xavier just decides to let Raven start up the X-Men again, because maybe the world needs them after all, and that seems more based on just generically, there was this big threat, that they weren't ready for, and maybe he was wrong that humans had fully accepted mutants after Stryker shows up out of nowhere and kidnaps his students, and not really because of how humanity might react specifically to the religion thing. Apocalypse himself is just kind of lame and uninspired. After Shaw and Trask, two fascinating characters using mutants for their own unique ends, we've got yet another power-hungry despot who believes might makes right and is all about survival of the fittest. Sure, that's what he is in the comics, and I have never found Apocalypse especially compelling, but if he's not going to be presented as an unchangeable force of nature, and what's interesting is how the world responds to him, then I need to be engaged at least by the character himself. He doesn't have the presence and gravitas of the comic and 90s cartoon version, and like Thanos, I miss the version who smiles and laughs and really enjoys what he's doing. That would have fit this material a lot more than this brooding, ultra-serious version. A movie that can't decide how bleak it wants to be, that struggles with blending the comedy and the drama, usually benefits from erring on the side of schlock and bombast than self-importance. I'm also torn on Apocalypse's face, because on the one hand, I respect that Oscar Isaacs, who is completely wasted in this role, is wearing prosthetics and I'm not watching an Uncanny Valley CG creature. Uncanny Valley X-Men. On the other hand, it would have been technically impressive if we could have had makeup enhanced with visual effects to make his mouth open across his mouth lines that go all the way up the sides of his face, like in the comics. It's kind of a letdown to me that the lines are there, but the mouth doesn't open all the way, and it's the sort of compromise we've seen in lower budget TV things like Inhumans. If the character were more interesting, I wouldn't care about this stuff as much, but I've got nothing to latch onto with this guy. It's like nobody really wanted to have to do Apocalypse, but that was just the next villain on a list. I don't know, maybe we would have gotten a better movie all around if it had been Sinister, instead of teasing him for 3 whole movies, the after credits here, Deadpool 2, and New Mutants, and never getting him before the license got bought out by Disney in the Fox deal. And whatever story you'd have told, it would have to be less epic in scale than this, which, again, you kind of needed after a big dire future time travel story. I also don't totally get Apocalypse's powers. He can transfer his consciousness into another mutant and bring each set of powers he acquires with him, but he needs a pyramid to do that? So is that his natural ability? If so, why does he need to enhance it with technology? And doesn't that make him a massive hypocrite? Since he hates technology, because if you need artificial help, you're weak? It's kind of weird that nobody calls him on that. I mean, is that just an easy explanation for the pyramids? How would you ever figure out you could do that if you need a pyramid? I know Apocalypse can enhance other mutants' powers, which is kind of just a cop-out so Magneto can move metal all over the world by touching the Earth. He also has portals like boom tubes that let him go wherever he wants, which, if memory serves, is a thing he has in the comics. And he leans really hard on that weird ability to manipulate matter so he can suck people into walls and the ground. Apocalypse is presented like I'm supposed to be fascinated by him, but he's just a big, lumbering Goa'uld from Stargate who moans and groans about the weak taking over and somehow manipulating people to do his bidding without actually doing anything to manipulate them, and who wants to take over Xavier's body so he can mind control everyone and take away free will. And at that point, I'm wondering what the point of being a god even is, but I mean, no reason to dwell on that. This guy has no perspective. He's just the obligatory capital V villain. This might be partly because I've read a little of the source material, but I saw this movie twice before I finally realized Apocalypse wasn't using any kind of mind control on his 4 horsemen. He just claims he wants to set them free instead of using them, like Caliban uses Psylocke, and they each either believe him or just go along with it because they know they can't fight him. Nobody talks about anything hardly at all in this movie, especially the monosyllabic new characters, like all of them. So I don't know what their motivations are fully in going with Apocalypse, and what I do understand seems pretty superficial. This movie is way too long for me to be wondering why characters are doing what they're doing as often as I am. Storm wants to be a hero, like Mystique, because somehow what she did in DC on TV for the world to see inspired a generation of mutants, when it just as easily could have confused them or made them wonder what her whole deal was. Even though Apocalypse disintegrates a bunch of guys in front of her and she tells him he can't just go around killing people, she goes with him when he says he wants to save the world. In ancient Egyptian, he says cleanse the world, but only the audience knows he said that because we have subtitles. See, a master manipulator, that Apocalypse. There's a really important deleted scene that gives us like 15 seconds of Storm explaining her background to Xavier that makes it clearer she's just going where the power is because she was raised in an oppressive and despotic culture. But then she turns on Apocalypse when he attacks her hero, Mystique. And I mean, I don't know what she thought was going to happen. It's weird it took that for her to do the right thing when he's got Magneto ripping metal out of the ground all over the planet and probably killing thousands and thousands of people. I absolutely adore Alexandra Shipp in this role with what little we get with her. She looks and sounds the part, and she has an endearing, noble quality that's perfect for a young Storm. Finally, we get a great, thick African accent for this character. I want her to grow up and get to play this character 15, 20 years from now, and she gets nothing to do. And Dark Phoenix hasn't stuck with me at all, but I'm pretty sure she gets just as little or less there. Man, do I wish Marvel had cast her first as a character in Wakanda. Drat. I've already complained about Angel. He gets even less characterization than Storm does. Not kidding, he's jaded because he's been used in an underground mutant fighting ring, but angrier because Nightcrawler messed up his wings. So as far as I can tell, he puts up with Apocalypse's genocide just because Apocalypse gives him metal wings, and he gets to shoot darts out of them. He never turns against Apocalypse, it doesn't seem like. He dies in a plane explosion before we have a chance to know how he feels about anything. Actually, that's not true. The Horsemen all have plenty of time to discuss things. The movie is 2.5 hours long, and they just stand on their mark and pose on rocks most of the time. I don't need telepathy to hear all of them saying, I'm finally in a huge franchise movie, and I'm a glorified cosplayer standing on rocks. Look at the expressions on everyone's faces in those scenes. They're miserable, and it's not because their characters are working for a genocidal madman. Speaking of cosplay, that is Psylocke's whole character. She's played by an actress, Olivia Munn, who is obsessed with the character of Psylocke, and I know more about her than I do about Psylocke. She was a mercenary or something, I guess, taking jobs from Caliban, and she works with Apocalypse because... and she never turns on Apocalypse because... and she just walks away at the end, and we're supposed to anticipate someday seeing her again, because she is a superpower and a costume. That is what she is. I don't know how true this is, but I remember reading before the movie came out that the only reason she has the comic-accurate costume is because Olivia Munn insisted on it. Doesn't make a lot of sense, though, because that's what Apocalypse gives her, and it looks Eastern-influenced when everything else he comes up with has an ancient Egyptian look to it. Poor Olivia Munn. She literally got to cosplay Psylocke in an X-Men movie, but didn't actually get to play her at all. And I feel like I can read the frustration on her face about this all the way through. And of course, the fourth horseman is... ridiculously, I think, Magneto. So we are finally ready to talk about our main characters. We're toward the end of the review, and it's crazy we're just now getting to this part. But the movie isn't that interested in any of these characters, so neither am I. Despite the fact that it has way too many and doesn't do the legwork to juggle them all well. Most of the new characters are just kind of there, without a good excuse not to draw some of the new faces like Days of Future Past did with the new X-Men of the future like Bishop and Blink. It made sense there that those weren't real developed. It wasn't about them, and they mostly just helped bookend the movie with the dystopian future and gave us a sense of how the X-Men were fighting for their survival. The first two movies in this trilogy were about a triad, like Star Trek The Original Series in Xavier, Magneto, and Mystique. Apocalypse feels like it's about everyone and no one at the same time. Some other characters might get small arcs and might be well developed, like Beast, but they're supporting characters for 3 protagonists throughout these films. Those 3 are still technically the characters with the most to do here and the most to learn, but their arcs are all thin, weak, and rushed, and they don't feel like the natural next step in their progression. Eric's arc is about embracing his Magneto side again because his family is taken from him, helping Apocalypse because he's lost everything, and he uses this as an opportunity to lash out at the whole world. And then, realizing Charles and Raven are his real family, he embraces his humanity again. And it works fine up to the moment where his family gets killed. So 5 whole minutes. This situation is so insanely manufactured, I would have almost preferred if Eric was killed off in the first act, like Professor X in The Last Stand. Again, it's like it's made by someone brand new, who doesn't understand this character or why he's killed before. Like if Brett Ratner made it. When Apocalypse is resurrected, part of the Earth shakes and Poland happens to be in the earthquake zone, so someone almost gets killed in the factory where Eric is working, and he uses his powers to stop a vat of boiling liquid from dropping on a guy. Someone realizes he must be Magneto and calls the cops on him. Now, importantly, nothing that happens as a result has anything whatsoever to do with racism or hatred of mutants. Magneto is a wanted fugitive and is believed to be dangerous. He's got international wanted posters. I would call the police too. So the cops show up in the woods, where they found his daughter. They haven't kidnapped her, I don't think. I'm a little fuzzy about why she's there, and Eric offers to turn himself in. Then in I think misguided parallel to Eric's tragic origin scene at Auschwitz, his daughter panics and uses her mutant power on accident, which is some kind of ability to control animals or make them attack people somehow. The police are understandably startled. You would be too, while they all have their bows drawn. They're using bow and arrows instead of guns because guns are made of metal. And while the birds are flying everywhere and swooping down, one of these cops accidentally lets his arrow fly, and not on purpose. The man isn't quick on the draw, he doesn't panic, he just can't keep a hold of his bow, and it happens to go through Eric's daughter and straight through to his wife, killing them both, which is pretty convenient. Honestly, if I had remembered more of this movie, it might have made it onto the top 10 contrived superhero movie moments episode. So Eric snaps. He takes the locket with the picture of his parents, again, like the scene has any real comparison to what happened with the Nazis, and he uses his powers to shoot it through every one of those men. Only one of them is at fault, and it was an honest mistake, and none of the other cops did anything at all. And then he goes to the factory and plans to kill everyone there, just because someone called the police on him for being a fugitive. Only reason he doesn't kill them is because Apocalypse does it for him. And I could kind of see all of this if the idea was Eric is actually an unstable, broken, unhinged man who can't tell the difference between bigotry and logical, measured responses to this specific situation. If he was just too far gone and became a straight-up serial killer instead of just killing people who kind of objectively deserved it in first class, maybe I'd buy that. But it's played like he's supposed to be as sympathetic as he always was. Like he still has a point or something. Like the movie thinks I'm so stupid, I'll sympathize with Magneto because I know he's cast as the sympathetic villain. This absolutely has that Sandman thing from Spider-Man 3, where I'm supposed to understand any terrible thing he does because something bad happened to him. Makes it okay for him to break the law. Every person he kills in this movie is innocent or didn't mean to do the horrible thing they did. He tells Xavier over Cerebro Chat that humans took everything from him, so he's going to take everything from them. Dude, it was one guy, and it was an honest mistake. Now maybe Eric is so cynical he doesn't get that, and thinks that guy killed his family on purpose because his daughter is a mutant. But Xavier gets in his head, sees everything Eric saw, and he has nothing but sympathy for him, has nothing to say about this. What? I thought it was bad enough Xavier worked with Eric in first class and didn't seem concerned at all that he'd killed a bunch of guys for revenge, deserved or not. Xavier can't possibly condone that. And they never had a conversation there about how violence and vengeance-driven he is. But here, it is totally inexcusable. I was completely dumbfounded in the theater when Charles tells Eric at the end he wishes he would stay. So he gets to go off on his own, after being responsible for the murder of a couple dozen people, and then probably thousands more, as Apocalypse's one-man destroy the world and make it a better place machine, Just because Raven's "you still have a family" speech somehow worked, and he threw metal beams in front of Apocalypse in the shape of an X. It's like everyone is playing at being real compassionate human beings, but again, nobody has any actual regard for human life in this movie. Magneto kills with no remorse and is rewarded for it. Xavier doesn't care. Jean lets out a savage wild man to murder paid government soldiers who are probably doing nothing wrong themselves anyway. The whole piece is totally out of touch. In his commentary, Singer references the famous comic event Age of Apocalypse a number of times. And considering his continued disregard for comics, I have a hard time believing he's actually read more than the first issue of that, especially because he acts like the opening scenes are somehow influenced by that book. It's really awkward. He says everyone is in a different place than you've seen them before or expect to see them, just like at the beginning of Age of Apocalypse. That's why Magneto has a family now. It's so crazy and subverts your expectations. Except, that has nothing to do with Age of Apocalypse. Those characters were in unusual places there, some of them anyway, because that was an altered timeline in which Xavier was dead and Magneto formed the X-Men. By the way, Wolverine is on that team and goes by Weapon X, and I'm convinced that's partly why Weapon X showed up in this movie. 10 years have passed. Of course some of these characters are somewhere else, doing something else. You're going to have a different status quo a decade later. Same thing last movie after the 10 years between First Class and Days of Future Past. So what? We're to the point here where every 10 years, almost on the dot, some new threat creates an excuse for a family reunion. Also, Xavier is exactly where you expect him to be, as is Hank. And C, a lot of these characters are new, so we wouldn't have expectations about where they'd be, necessarily. I wish this had been more based on Age of Apocalypse. The story doesn't have much to do with that, beyond Apocalypse outright trying to take over the world, which he actually does in that comic event. But it would be a lot more interesting if Magneto was running the school at the beginning of this movie. And Singer brings that up, too. He's like, I know it's not as different as that. He says Magneto's not running the school per se. I'm like, per se? He's not running it at all. What are you talking about? Now, that would shock everyone in a cool way. If we bought it, at least. Again, not trying to totally rewrite the story. I think what's here could have been done better. But it does lead me to imagine far more creative notions. This trilogy bookends with origins for no good reason. Why couldn't the new X-Men just all be established already? Cyclops begrudgingly going to Xavier's school and controlling his powers is so rushed anyway. What is the point in seeing it? I'd have loved to see Magneto and his X-Men have to fight Apocalypse, who has maybe already taken things over at the start of the movie and has either seemed to have killed Xavier or have already taken over his body. After Days of Future Past, I would think you'd really want to go in medias res. Or make Xavier something akin to Onslaught. I don't know, the possibilities are endless. If you just get a move on and stop pretending like the point of telling stories is always to see how things begin. This is the 4th X-Men origin movie. 4! But at the very least, couldn't the X-Men have already been established, even if we have to watch some new ones get initiated? Xavier's arc isn't quite as hackneyed as Magneto's, although the way he loses his hair certainly is, but it's not good. Hank is frustrated because Xavier didn't want to start the X-Men right away, so he's been getting tech ready for the day the world will inevitably need them again. After Trask tried to convince the military to go to war with mutants, I think it's asinine to say Xavier is naive enough to think the world has embraced mutants right after learning about them and that he doesn't need to form a new X-Men team. That's a manufactured subplot so Raven can have her arc about learning to be a leader even though she doesn't want to, because she's so clearly a naturally born hero after she chose not to kill a guy. I still don't think a viewing audience would fully even understand what was going on there. Raven tells him he thinks humans are at peace with mutants because he lives in Westchester and doesn't see the world outside where she's having to rescue people like Nightcrawler from oppressive situations. Okay, but Xavier has Cerebro, right? Does he never use it? No one on the planet should have more perspective on this than Xavier. He can look at all the humans and all the mutants separately. You know, the red lights and the white lights. listening to what the consensus is on each front. It makes no sense to me that he would be blind to what's happening in the world. And again, even if he's not paying attention, I'd think he'd err on the side of caution after Trask. But no, it takes Apocalypse, an ancient mutant resurrected by a tiny cult like a once-in-a-blue-moon kind of scenario, to wake him up. There are also no consequences for Xavier wiping Moira's memories in First Class and then returning them at the end of this. She seems just fine with the fact that he did that to her, and he has no good reason not to give her those memories back when he's crushing on her like a schoolboy when they meet again, because the world knows about mutants now. Unless it's because he doesn't trust her because she works for the CIA, as he alludes to when he shows her Cerebro. But then he gives her those memories back at the end of the movie for no reason other than he almost died in his Mindscape fight with Apocalypse, just so we can see him giant like in the comics and she's the first face he sees. Nothing happens because of logical choices characters are making. If this is anyone's movie, I guess it's supposed to be Mystique's, but I don't buy the initial premise, much less where she's left at the end. It really feels like her whole arc is built around the fact that Jennifer Lawrence didn't like wearing that blue makeup. And I think it's easy to get around that anyway. It never made sense in First Class that she thought she had to walk around naked anyway. Why not just have a blue face, but shapeshift clothes? Singer even talks about that on the commentary. He says she was always going back and forth between not wanting to make any more of these and saying she loved making them, but only if she didn't have to wear that makeup so much. So her arc is about choosing to hide so she's not the face of, as she says, a world that doesn't exist. A world where you can look like a mutant and be safe. Never mind all that mutant and proud stuff from First Class, looking like yourself because you shouldn't have to hide. But that is just an excuse. She's really not comfortable with the hero moniker any more than Jennifer Lawrence is comfortable with the makeup. And that's okay. I'm not comfortable with it either. Like I said earlier, don't believe that's how most mutants would react to what happened on the White House lawn. By the end, she learns to embrace her blue form again in order to inspire the new students, who she teaches to not control their powers, but to embrace them in order to fight Apocalypse. Which is what Jean does when she unleashes the full Phoenix, just so Singer can put a stamp on that, foreshadowed by a dream sequence earlier where she sees the end of the world and her causing it at the same time as Apocalypse rises. I don't know what that's about, except the movie doesn't want Phoenix to look like it came out of nowhere at the end. So now Mystique is the reluctant leader of the X-Men at the end because it's her destiny now to be thrust into that role. Isn't that clever? Because she's a bad guy in the original timeline. Never mind all that cool mystery we just ignored and squandered surrounding her at the end of the last movie. And Singer thinks it's so clever to make her Mutant Harriet Tubman. Yeah, that's how he describes her in the commentary. Spoilers for Dark Phoenix, and I hate to say it, but yeah, I'm glad she's dead. She's insufferable in that last scene, where she says, "You're not students, you're X-Men," and they can't be both, and she's even more intolerable in the beginning of the next movie, partly because Lawrence clearly doesn't want to be there. Couldn't she have made the big self-sacrifice at the end of this movie? That actually would have been a better motivator for Xavier to finally reestablish the X-Men. Okay, I don't know how I have this much to say about this movie, but let's close out with a round of, you know what's irritating, shall we? Hey, you know what's irritating? Period pieces where the time period they're set in have no real bearing on the story. Nothing clever or fun or poignant is done with 1983, except in a really faithfully designed mall in that montage that got cut. We really need another insanely long superhero movie set in 1985 so we can complete the 2.5-hour 80s period trilogy with this and Wonder Woman 84. Oh, and you know what's irritating? When you're looking at characters who are supposed to be 20 years older than the first movie they appeared in, but the movie doesn't even try to age them up, and you're not even sure if it knows how old they are, Havoc has to be at least 36, if not 40. He's 20 years older than his brother, but their parents look 50, and at one point Scott says, "It should have been me." He was supposed to be the one who did something with his life. When? He's middle-aged already. Oh, you know what else is irritating? When a character uses her powers one time in a not at all exciting way, and it's also in a scene that gets cut from the movie. Jubilee, again in the mall, uses her fireworks powers to make an arcade machine play for free. However that works. That's all you get, and you don't even get that. This is also totally irritating. Speedsters that can make anything go fast just because they can. Quicksilver plays Pac-Man at his house, and somehow makes Pac-Man move faster than he regularly goes. Running fast doesn't make video game characters go fast. And speaking of Quicksilver, you know what's irritating? Making a character not proactive just to manufacture another trilogy inside of 2 sets of movies. The only thing that can make Magneto turn on Apocalypse is apparently feeling like he has a family, and Quicksilver won't go tell him he's his son. I don't know why. There's no discussion about it. He just gets cold feet and tells Storm at the end he might someday. Like, that has to happen in Quicksilver's 3rd movie to give his character a trilogy. It wouldn't have made Magneto's arc much better, but I might have slightly bought his reversal more if it was flesh and blood family he was fighting for. The family he decides is worth saving the world for apparently isn't worth staying around and living with. Before we get to my rating, let's find out what some of the patrons had to say with tweet-linked reviews, and I got quite a response on this one. Folks are very opinionated about this movie. Let's start with Malik Myers. I don't care what anyone says, the Quicksilver scene in this movie is pretty awesome. The rest of this film is a total mess and hard to sit through. Saqib Tariq, the cast is good overall, and the Quicksilver scene is great, but like Wonder Woman 84, it doesn't make the best of the time period and is forgettable in the end, 2 out of 4. Ben Thompson, hard proof that Bryan Singer has lost his touch with the X-Men franchise. This movie should have been epic in scope like Age of Ultron, instead it's a boring slog. Lawrence may even give the worst performance of her career, but everyone else is trying at least. 1 out of 4. John Sandoval, a boring disappointment. This should have been another great X-Men movie with a great villain. What a disappointment after Days of Future Past. 1 out of 4. Nick Manna, X-Men Apocalypse ruins story potential. The Days of Future Past near perfectly set up. Apocalypse has an overcomplicated story with an unengaging villain and lacks substantial character moments. It just all feels off. 1.5 out of 4. Connor Nielsen, a disappointing 3rd outing for the returning cast and an underwhelming debut for the newcomers. Apocalypse is full of repeated character arcs, half-baked ideas, bad special effects, and weak action. A few scenes I'm fond of, but overall it's a wannabe epic that Singer struggles to bring together. 1.5 out of 4. From Rockman LP, an uninspired film that lets down its strong cast, failing to build on the opportunities created by its predecessor, even leaning on past films to borrow iconic moments. Apocalypse had great villain and world-building potential that sadly went unfulfilled. 2 out of 4. Bag Studios. Some don't mind Star Wars Episode 9 as much, as the potential was already ruined by Episode 8, air quotes. I don't share that opinion, but I very much echo it here. After the brilliant Days of Future Past, Apocalypse entirely wastes every ounce of potential. Dark Phoenix was doomed. This ruins the franchise, and it hurts. 0.5 out of 4. Chewbacca's Lover. It sucked. It ruined the franchise. The Day Ghost, a huge step down after First Class and Days of Future Past. I can't really decide whether it's better or worse than The Last Stand, but Apocalypse also wants to be the 3rd film and the 1st film of a trilogy. There is more for me to laugh at than Dark Phoenix, I guess. 1 out of 4. Elliot Slater, beginning of the end for Fox's X-Men franchise. Standard Tom, this is a shallow experience that feels like a checklist of events more than a fully realized narrative, wasting the franchise's momentum and the film's premise. Not the worst movie in the X-Men series, but definitely the most hollow. 1.5 out of 4. And finally, Josh Hughes, middling watch on a transatlantic flight. Watching at home does not improve the experience. Not as strong as the sum of its parts. 2 out of 4. Forgetting Bryan Singer's personal life and his reputation now, who knows what he was dealing with while he made this movie, given allegations and such recently, I get the feeling he was jaded about having to make more X-Men movies. Like, it was the work he could get right then, so that's what he did, but not really where he wanted to be. I don't know if I'm right about any of that. but it's the undercurrent I felt like I was sensing listening to him talk about it. He implies that in the opening credits, he intentionally put the Fox credit in front of a swastika and the Marvel credit in front of the Soviet hammer and sickle. He sounds sarcastic when he says it just worked out that way. Kinberg wrote a pretty hackneyed and uninspired script, and Singer's directing is serviceable with some decent acting. The man does know how to make a movie, but nobody's hearts really seemed in this aside from the cast, sans Jennifer Lawrence. There's some spectacular set building, especially the pyramid at the beginning. Great performances as always from Fassbender and McAvoy, even if I'm disappointed with character choices, and I like all the new cast. I know I'm in the minority here. I think Sophie Turner is an odd pick for Jean Grey, but she has decent chemistry with Ty Sheridan as Cyclops, who I think is perfectly cast. That Weapon X hallway fight is really well shot and storyboarded, and Hugh Jackman is having a blast finally playing Animal Wolverine. I just hate that scene as there. Before, I found this movie wholly unmemorable, and then I had to write about it. And now, well, I'm more than mildly irritated. It's a waste of a brilliant soft reboot, and I have to ignore it to enjoy my second favorite X-Men movie. And yeah, at least at the moment, I'm pretty sure I like it less than The Last Stand. I'm giving X-Men Apocalypse a 1 out of 4. Thanks a lot for listening, folks. Really hope you enjoyed this one. Next week, we're going to have a change of pace, and I'm going to tackle something a little simpler, a little shorter, and something that is more generally liked. I'm going to talk about the animated movie from 2009, Batman vs. Ninja Turtles, so look forward to that. That should be a lot of fun. And now I want to go ahead and put this movie in the full ranked list, which I have updated. It is totally current now, and I didn't do this last time because I didn't have the list quite put together yet, but from now on, hopefully I remember it each episode, I'm going to start doing this. So you can go to letterboxd.com. I'll put a link in the description, both in the podcast feed and on YouTube, and you'll be able to see my rankings. And we're doing this by number rankings if you haven't watched the ranking shows for each rewind. There may be some movies that seem odd as low as they are or as high as they are compared to certain other movies, and that's because all of the 3s are together, the 3.5s are together, etc., etc. This one, I rated a 1, so it's going to have to go pretty low, of course, and I think I'm going to sandwich it right between Elektra and Fant Forstick. I think that's where that fits. I almost put it right after Elektra, right under Batman and Robin, but I think Elektra is even a smidge more watchable than this, despite the fact that I don't care for that movie. Obviously, they're both boring. I don't see putting it under Brainiac Attacks, believe it or not. So it's going to be the new 126. Now I want to say thanks, as always, to all of our patrons. If you would like to support Superhero Rewind or Geekvolution at large, you can go to patreon.com/Geekvolution. At the $2 tier, you get early episodes of Superhero Rewind a few days before I post them publicly. And at the $5 tier, you can submit tweet-length reviews for each Superhero Rewind. And at the $10 tier, you can become a Patreon producer. And I want to say thanks, as always, to all of our producers right now individually. Let's start at the top and work our way down this time. Thanks a bunch to Red Bandit, Azim, Caleb, Chewbacca's Lover, Dylan Muschiello, Elliot Slater, Ian McKee, John McLean, Josh Hughes, Bag Studios, Carl Maxey, Kevin, Lone Wolf Jedi of Gotham, Snuffles Wrights, Stone Gassman, The Day Ghost, Thomas Edgehill, CM Productions, Damon McGay, Jacob Schneider, Kareem Roberts, Michael Gulick, Michael Micheletti, Nicholas Morgan, Nick Manna, Victor, Wendell Jones, Zach, Iron Bat 1993. You guys are all fantastic, and once again, thanks to all the patrons, and thanks to you very much for listening. See you again next time with Batman vs. Ninja Turtles. Bye, everybody.